Welcome to another episode of the Mystery Bible on Podcast. This is episode 23, and we're so excited about this episode. We have with us here in our virtual studio, Mr. Derek Gilbert, author of several books, including tonight's topic, a book titled The Second Coming of Saturn. And I know you guys are just going to absolutely love Mr. Gilbert and the hard work and research he's put into his content. This is really apropos to the discussions we've been having on spiritual warfare and knowing the enemy, and there's a lot of fun directions this can go. I've benefited tremendously from Mr. Gilbert and his writing and some of the podcast stuff he does. We'll make sure you get connections to all that and links to that. But enough from me. Let me give you the quick overview, and then we're going to hand the mic over to Mr. Gilbert for some of his thoughts. But just so you know and have some context, if you're not familiar with him, Mr. Gilbert is involved with Skywatch TV. He's the author of groundbreaking books, including Bad Moon Rising, which we were just discussing before we hit record here. And that is an analysis of the spiritual forces behind Islam, very appropriate to today's current events. Those of you who didn't hear our last episode may not know we spent quite a bit of time discussing the situation in Israel. He also wrote The Great Inception and Last Clash of the Titans, and of course, The Second Coming of Saturn. He's the co-author with his wife Sharon Gilbert of Giants, Gods, and Dragons. They have a book that he's co-authored with Josh Peck. Some of you may know Josh Peck, The Day the Earth Stands Still. And then there's a Bible study series that I've recommended to a handful of people called Gilbert House Fellowship, which you can find at gilberthouse.org. And there's a whole lot of things I've left out of there. But that's so that you, dear listeners, have some context on who we are talking with tonight. We're honored to have Mr. Derek Gilbert join us. There are two things I want to start with. One that I want to acknowledge, those of you who are in our Telegram thread and our chat room are familiar with Tom Horn, and we had some discussion recently on his passing. And you may not know that Derek Gilbert has worked very closely with Tom Horn for many years, and I wanted to give him a chance to, first of all, share any thoughts on the passing of Mr. Tom Horn, and then we'll get into our content tonight. So, Mr. Gilbert, welcome to the Mystery Bible on Podcast. Our listeners are excited to have you here. We're excited to have you here. And before we get into tonight's content, please feel free to share your thoughts on the passing of our friend, Mr. Tom Horn.
Well, Joel, Dan, Brian, thank you. It's an honor to be here tonight, and an honor to call Tom Horn a friend. We first met Tom, I guess, virtually, as he was a regular guest on Steve Quayle's shortwave radio broadcast 20 years ago. And when Sharon and I were just coming into this sort of alternative Christianity niche that we're a part of now, we would listen to Steve Quayle every night and hear this crazy guy in the Ozarks, or actually he was still in Oregon at the time, who would talk about giants and end times prophecy, and he was very early in discussing transhumanism and the goal to overcome death, to become as gods ourselves through science and technology. And we just found Tom's work, as we did with Steve Quayle's work, fascinating. And when we began to podcast in 2005, which started as an effort to market some novels that we had written, and after we did the first episode, which is, buy our books, the second week was like, okay, what do we do now with the podcast? Oh, well, let's start talking about why we write what we write. And that led us to figure out ways to begin interviewing people. So we were very early in 2005, 2006, before tools like Skype and Zoom and StreamYard and Restream and Ustream and We All Stream were available. It was really a Rube Goldberg setup where we were using a cordless phone, a Radio Shack doohickey with alligator clips, a Sony Handycam, and my MacBook to get audio in and out. And because the internet was still dial-up in those days, at least for us, it was, we had to compress the audio down to worse than AM radio quality. So, but that's how we got started down this. And Tom was very gracious with his time in granting us interviews. And I guess we asked good questions, because when he set up the first Branson Prophecy Conference, the Prophecy Summit in Branson back in 2011, he invited us to come and set up our podcasting gear. And so we came and we interviewed guests, and then That led to coming back the second year where somebody got the idea to put a camera in the room and record that for bonus DVD content for the conference, which led to us being invited to speak at the conferences, which by 2014, we were kind of regulars on the prophecy conference circuit, I guess. Sharon, when Ebola broke out in West Africa in 2014, Tom asked if Sharon, who's got a degree in molecular biology, could write something about Ebola from a biblical prophecy perspective. Because, on the one hand, she's a scientist, but she's also a Bible-believing Christian. And so she wrote the book Ebola and the Fourth Horseman of the Apocalypse. And if you can believe it, a book with that kind of title, she actually made it uplifting and encouraging. Tom published the book and invited us here to the Ozarks almost exactly 9 years ago. It was October of 2014. We came out here, and he invited Sharon to be one of the pilot guests for the pilot episodes of what would become Skywatch TV. Gary Stearman was the host at that time. And so she came, and we came, and she did the interview with Gary, and it was packaged into a program that was then sent out to get Skywatch TV onto Christian television networks. But while we were here that weekend, Tom then had to go with Nita to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, because Tom was speaking at Chuck Missler's Strategic Perspectives Conference. And while we were here, but before he left, he said, "Would you consider moving down here and joining me in this Skywatch TV project?" Now, Gary was to be the host. I was just going to do a daily news update, and then Sharon would contribute some artistic abilities. She's got some graphic design chops. She actually laid out the Skywatch TV magazine for several years.
Is there anything Sharon can't do? She's a molecular biologist. She writes novels. She co-authors your books, does the graphic design. It sounds like she holds everything together.
She trained to sing opera and sang professionally for 20 years. So, yeah, she's got both halves of her brain engaged. Yeah. So you can understand why my father once took me aside and said, "Son, you married up."
Yeah, I can understand. I think all of us can understand that, knowing these guys' lives too. So.
But anyway, this was the kind of trust that Tom put in Sharon and me. Tom was a guy who never really saw obstacles. He said, "Okay, we want to get on Roku. So Joe, Derek, Josh, you figure out how to make it happen." And like, okay. And so we did. We figured out how to make it happen. Who can do a magazine? Sharon's like, "Well, I know how to use Adobe InDesign. I guess I can do that." So, okay, great. So, okay, now we got a magazine. Tom would just see something, and he was the vision guy. He could, when we moved down here, I was working as a steel salesman, outside sales for a steel company based out of Alabama, and doing well. I mean, one of those Cadillac insurance plans that kind of went by the boards with the Affordable Care Act. Anyway, the people I worked with thought we were crazy. So you're going to do what? You're going to go put this Christian and you guys are going to talk about what? Giants and UFOs, and how does that relate to the Bible? But it worked. Again, Skywatch TV debuted in, I think the first episodes were broadcast nationally in March of 2015. And after a few months, Gary Stearman, who had to travel here to the Ozarks from Oklahoma City, the travel was just too much. So Tom then entrusted me with hosting the program for several years, until a couple of years ago the new studio was built, and it was time for Joe Horn to take over, which understandable because this was Tom's vision and really keeping it in the family. I totally understand it, but again, they appreciated what we do enough to say, "Would you consider staying on to just do the daily news analysis, because that draws a lot of attention to what we're doing at Skywatch TV." Said, okay, sure. So Tom entrusted Sharon and me with a lot, even though we don't come from a traditional ministry background. Neither of us is ordained. I don't have an MDiv, or in fact, my only degree is in economics. But
that's a fantastic undergrad. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, but he saw in us something that would, in fact, he told us back as far as 2006 when we were just doing our little, podcast, Peering into Darkness Radio, PID Radio. He said, you've got a ministry, you've got a church, you've got an outreach. I'm like, yeah, I'm just a frustrated radio guy who has to, has a psychological need to tell people what he thinks. But Tom insisted.
Yeah, that sounded personal.
So all of that led to what we're doing now, and it was clearly the hand of God was at work. We moved here just before, at a perfect time in terms of the finances, the economy. We got a wonderful property overlooking, and it was cheaper than the subdivision home that we sold in a small town in southern Illinois. We've got a nice property here overlooking cattle pasture. So we look out the back window, and when the cattle are up against the fence, it's like, wow, okay, never saw that when I was growing up in Chicago. And this was all Tom Horn. Tom, most people know from seeing him in interviews, from seeing his conference presentations or documentary presentations where he's dressed in a suit and tie and looking very pastoral. And he's got those, that very serious, somber look when he's talking about these things like, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Nephilim, the Vatican, the things like that. And he's got those Nephilim hunter eyebrows that he could bring to bear. But those of us who saw him off camera, he was usually wearing a ratty T-shirt, jeans with holes in them, an old baseball cap, and he was driving a tractor or an earth mover or something at Whispering Ponies Ranch, because that was really his passion. The ministry that they built in Skywatch TV was just to finance the operations at Whispering Ponies Ranch, which is a facility that is offered at no charge to ministries like Royal Family Kids, that works exclusively with children in foster care between the ages of 9 and 11. And then Teen Challenge, which takes kids who age out of programs like Royal Family Kids. They don't pay a dime for the use of the facility or the use of the therapy animals, the miniature horses that Nita Horn raises, which are... They're used in therapy situations just like therapy dogs, and it's astonishing seeing the way children who have been so badly abused and broken that they assume that every adult who pays attention to them wants something from them. Suddenly seeing those barriers begin to break down when these little ponies come over and they have no agenda other than scratch my nose. And then they see the trust and the love that the ponies have for their handlers. And that allows then the doors to open and for these children to begin to heal as they see that there are adults out there who will show the love of Christ, that we will protect them and nurture them rather than use them. And that was Tom's passion. And that is something that Joe Horn, I know the children, all three, Donna Howell, Allie Anderson, Joe Horn, really feel a burden to continue that legacy. And as long as Sharon and I can do it and be of any kind of support with what we're doing through our own ministry now, and again, I'm still on staff technically at Skywatch TV, we will continue to do that to honor the legacy of Tom Horn. Tom Horn's legacy is not in, Nephilim hunting. What Tom Horn's legacy is in Whispering Ponies Ranch and the children whose lives have been changed through the use of those facilities. And that is what we want to honor as we go forward.
Well, I can imagine that the Lord Jesus is very interested in the work that Tom does at the ranch, and probably not all that interested in the Nephilim stuff in terms of the treasure in heaven, the reward in heaven that Tom's surely enjoying now. And
other than it drew people in,
it draws people in.
Supporting the ministry is like, wow, this helps make some of the weird stuff in the Bible make sense.
Yeah.
But then again, those resources that were
underprivileged kids are so close to his heart, so important. I know that's close to Dan Rundio as well, who's on with us. He's done a lot of work in the foster space, and we've done a lot of work as a group with orphans. And it's when it comes down to it, say, well, I don't know about all the all the weird academic stuff we talk about, but I know Jesus cares about this little guy, and I also feed the birds because the Bible says he likes the birds too. So I'm going to go.
We do a lot of that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, I appreciate you sharing that. And part of the reason why we wanted to take that time is so that our audience understands that we who are hosting Mystery Bible On all the time, we stand on the shoulders of other people. I mean, Dan and Brian and I do a tremendous amount of reading and research, as I know you do, but we are able to take a lot of shortcuts because people like you and Tom and Chuck Messler, to whom I also owe a debt of gratitude, and Dr. Michael Heiser and people like that, some who have passed and some who are still with us, have done so much of the work that we can come up to speed relatively quickly, and we borrow so much from that content. And I have a handful of Tom's books on my shelf behind me, and there was, in fact, a funny short story about one of those. I in my last office, there was a water pipe break, and it completely flooded the office, and nothing got wet besides the floor. The only thing that was destroyed was one copy of one of Tom's books, and it was one about the creatures, the fey creatures, and some of those coming through the gates of hell.
Okay.
And that was the only thing that got destroyed, and the room was full of stuff. And I thought, whatever happened, because it was a horribly timed water break, not that there's ever a good one, but I thought it just seemed kind of personal that this is the one thing that got destroyed. And I actually have the old wrinkled, dried out copy that I kept because it was the only thing in the whole room that actually got demolished in that. And so it's been an interesting history, and I wanted to make sure we acknowledge Tom and some of the others that have done so much of the hard work over many years to make sure that when we talk about things like the Nephilim and giants and the Book of Enoch and the nation of Israel and these sorts of things, we're well informed because people have done hard work and spent decades providing good, well-researched material from a gospel perspective, and we're able to double and triple check the kinds of things we're saying against other people who put a lot of thought into this. So thanks for sharing that, and I do hope our audience, if they're not familiar with Tom Horn's work, that they are able to do that soon. So now that we have breached the topic a little bit, I want to give you kind of a space to address a question we've been trying to address a little bit with our audience. And the question is, what in the world is going on? Because something's going on, and I think anybody who's paying attention can feel it. And I think it's been going on for a while, but there's definitely a sense of escalation, intensifying. There's the vibrations reaching kind of a fever pitch in some way. And I think a lot of people feel that in different ways. And so I don't think any of us knows exactly how, but it's related to the kinds of stuff we're talking about. So Derek Gilbert, while we've got you here, can you please tell us what in the world is going on?
Answer that question with 100% confidence, but as Paul wrote, we're looking into a mirror in a darkened room, so it's all backwards and insufficiently lit. I think we are seeing the birth pangs that are heralding the coming of the end of the age. What we're seeing with Israel, what began on October 7th, was shocking in its barbarity. Just to give it context, here in the United States, we're calling this, Israel's 9/11, but Israel's a nation of 9.5 million people. So roughly speaking, we've got 35 times the population here in the United States. So take just to use round numbers, the 1,000, it's actually 1,400 dead on the Israeli side since this began. Multiply that by 35. 35,000 people killed in the space of a morning. And then another, another 7,000 abducted. That would be like what the Israelis are dealing with right now for the size of their country. Well, 35,000 people, that's like the entire county in which I live.
Yeah, and proportionally, it's a huge amount of the population. And then you've spent enough time in Israel, I've spent some time there as well, to know that it's a highly integrated society. So there's a very good chance that practically everybody there knows somebody who nobody knows where they are or if they're alive anymore, or knows for sure that they're not alive. So it touches everybody, and it becomes very personal very quickly.
Yeah, that's very true. The other thing that we Americans don't really understand is the size of the country and the risk that is posed. I grew up hearing what the Western media, the corporate media here in the United States, told us about the Israeli-Palestinian Arab conflict. And so, when you're young and you're liberal, My dad used to repeat, I think it was Winston Churchill who said, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you have no heart, but if you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you have no brain. And my dad used to repeat that, and I now see the wisdom of that. When I was younger, I used to think, well, gosh, if the Israelis just weren't so mean. But then when you actually begin to see what goes on there, when you start doing a little reading of history of the relations between Islam and the West, going back to the early 7th century when Muhammad invented his religion, and understand that the reason the West is called the West is because that's all that was left of Christendom at the peak of the Muslim invasions of Europe. The West, because the East had all been conquered and enslaved.
Yeah. That's something people don't realize, that the reason the Crusades got started in the first place is because of a direct ask by the head of the Byzantine Empire to the Pope saying, we are getting destroyed here by these Islamists. Please come help us.
Yeah.
That's the first crusade.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And that's not the way it's presented to kids in school. Academia doesn't take that view. The media here doesn't take that view. And so you really have to search it out in order to find it. And then when you go to Israel and you see how small that country is and realize that when we were there in 2019, we were able to go up Mount Bental, which is near the border between Israel and Syria. On a clear day, you can see Damascus from there. We weren't able to because dust from the Arabian desert, which is also very close, Saudi Arabia to the south, often fills the air and makes it a little hazy. But you can see into Lebanon. In fact, a friend of ours, Avi Lipkin, tells me that where he lives in Samaria, which is what the world calls the West Bank, they're in kind of a high spot. So you turn one direction, you can see Amman, Jordan. You turn the other direction, you can see Jerusalem. This is how close together these warring nations have been for 3,000 years. Well, actually 3,400 years, ever since Joshua led the Israelites across the Jordan near Jericho. They are, when we were there in 2018, thanks to Sharon's foresight, when we were asked to pick the dates for the tour, she said, let's pick, these dates in May. That'll coincide with the 70th anniversary of Israel's independence. And then Donald Trump said, let's move the embassy on that day. So we were there the very first day the sign in Jerusalem was changed, U.S. Embassy this way. And of course, Hamas declared days of rage on the border, and things blew up down there, and people were, burning tires and what have you. That's about as far from Jerusalem as I am right now from Springfield, Missouri, which we go to on a regular basis. So it's like we Americans don't really have a sense of the scope there. Back in the spring of this year, we went a few days early, and I'm working on a video now for this pre-tour expedition that Sharon and I and Pastor Doug Van Dorn and his wife Janelle did with the help of an archaeologist and Aaron Lipkin, who owns the tour company, who loves flying his HD video drone and sharing the video footage, which is fantastic because we got some video footage of some megalithic sites that nobody else in the world has. But we had to go to one location. We didn't have to. We wanted to visit one location that's mentioned in the book of Enoch, the book of First Enoch, which tells the story of the sin of these rebellious angelic beings called Watchers, who decided to interfere in human history by commingling with humanity, creating these monstrous hybrid giants who nearly destroyed the world until God sent the flood. They were called out by God, and he decreed a punishment on them. And so they wrote up basically a note begging God to let them return. They gave it to Enoch. This is the story. I mean, this was written probably in the 4th century BC, long after the events that took place, but it tells the story of what happened. And Enoch presented their petition to God. God basically, in a dream, tells Enoch, go back to these angels and tell them, forget it. They're not getting back up here. So Enoch delivers God's judgment at a place called, it looks in English like Abel Main, A-B-E-L space M-A-I-N. It's Avel Maim. It means waters of weeping, because these angels basically were weeping because they'd been caught, essentially. I don't know that they were sorry for what they did, but they were caught because they were being punished. A scholar identified this as the place where a stream that flows down from Lebanon, called the Ayun, goes down a waterfall and descends into a valley that the Jordan River flows through between Mount Hermon on the north and the Sea of Galilee in the south. And so we wanted to go visit this place. I mean, I think I've got the gestures turned on my little video thing here. We wanted to visit this place because it is a significant event in the history of humanity. God basically decreeing punishment on these rebellious entities who rejected his authority. And to get to this place, this little park where this waterfall, beautiful series of waterfalls, cascades down into this valley, we had to go through a village called Metula. Metula is the northernmost village in Israel. It is surrounded on 3 sides by the border with Lebanon. Now, this is a farming village. It's a farming community. It's got farms outside the city walls, village walls, a couple hundred people. But what struck me after 8.5 years of living in rural America, where, we've got a house here, we got, a quarter mile up the road is another house, there's another house a quarter of a mile south of us. There's nothing on the far side of the road, volunteer firehouse, but because of the terrain, there's nothing across the road from us. It's not that way in Israel. When you've got a rural community, a farming community, you have to gather together, live in a village, inside walls. All the farm equipment has to come inside the village and be parked in a big communal garage because you can't live outside the walls unless you want to invite Hezbollah to come into your home, kill you, or take your wife and daughter captive. We Americans just don't have any concept of what living like that is like. But that's why you don't see, like in rural America, farm, a mile, another farm, another mile, another farm. I mean, Southern Illinois, which was my outside sales territory for 4 years, when there were places I would go to and it would be like farm, couple of miles, farm. In Israel, the farmers all live together inside a walled village. That's their reality. And we here in the West have the audacity to tell them, you need to treat those neighbors better because what they're doing, you made them do this. See what you made them do? No, I'm sorry. Number one, that's historically illiterate. Secondly, it is religiously illiterate when you look at what Islam actually teaches and the history of how they have lived it out over the last 1,400 years. Now, are there bad people, bad things been done by Zionists on the Israeli side? Yeah. We Americans, even those of us who are proud to be Americans and patriotic, can we admit that the bad things were done by the early European colonists to the Native Americans? Yeah. But I'm sorry, if you can't look at what happened October 7th, 2023, and the slaughter of those 260-some people at the music festival, the slaughter of more than 100 in Kfar Aza, the kibbutz on the border with Gaza, and say that that is just flat evil.
Oh, it's evil.
Then your moral compass is broken.
So putting it in those terms, because it is evil, and we've had some of that discussion here, and we believe it is. It's not just evil the way that a secular person would say, "Oh, I strongly disagree with that." It's evil. It's evil because we believe it is inspired of the evil one and directed by the evil one. Let's use that to move into some of the discussion that I know you have deep and well-informed thoughts on, and this war between good and evil that's going on. Because we're seeing the political side of it, and we live with the moral consequences of it. And we liken some of the Israel atrocities to something we're unfortunately very familiar with here in the U.S. It's mass shootings. And imagine all the mass shootings we know happening at the same time all over the country, right, and not stopping and going on through women and children and just barbarically. And that's sort of what it's trying to get people analogously to the level of outrage on what's happening in Israel. But it's ultimately a battle between the evil one and the creator. Mm-hmm. And we happen to be caught in the middle of it. And I'm obviously overgeneralizing here. One of the things we're trying to get to in our discussions and our interactions with our audience is, okay, if there's a war, who are we fighting? What are we doing? How do we train and operate? And what is the postmodern American Western evangelicals' role in the spiritual war that's going on, that's taking a very real toll in some places? How do we get prepared? Where do we get smarter? How do we wage this war?
Well, I think first of all, we need to acknowledge the existence of the enemy. One of the things that's really jumped out at me once I finally began to grasp the existence of, and you used the phrase evil one. But I think you would agree when I say it's not just an evil one, it's evil many.
And feel free to elaborate on that, by the way. We talked about that before we hit record a little bit.
Right. As Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And we just sort of skip over that verse. Oh, yeah, spiritual warfare. Lord, save me from the spirit of eating too much ice cream. Our friend Carl Gallup said, spiritual warfare is a little more serious than that. What Paul meant was that evil intelligences, call them fallen angels, demons, he used a variety of terms: powers, principalities, thrones, dominions, archons, world powers, cosmic rulers, many different translations into English of the Greek terms that Paul used. But it was clear that he understood that there were evil intelligences, evil spirits in the unseen realm that were actively working against their Creator, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh. The prophets and the apostles understood this. The early church understood this. And this is what really, I think, opened my eyes. The work of Dr. Michael Heiser in understanding the divine counsel concept, which is a phrase that you see in Psalm 82, where God takes his place in the midst of the divine counsel. In the midst of the gods, he passes judgment. Basically, that if you look at that and it's like, now wait a minute, unless he's talking about imaginary beings, then we've got to reframe our paradigm here, because in the Western church, we've been taught, well, there's only one God. And I think the problem is our hang-up on that three-letter word G-O-D. We assume that it is a proper name that only applies to one entity in creation, the one who spoke it all into existence. But that's not how God himself uses that word in the Bible. If you read it carefully, in Psalm 82, though you are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High, like men you shall die. Wait, what? So getting your head around that opens your eyes to the idea that, wait a minute, maybe there's more than just Satan. And by the way, survey after survey here in America shows that about 60% of American Christians don't even believe Satan is real. So forget about these other fallen angels that the pagans call gods. Forget about demons. We stopped believing in them when we discovered the science of psychiatry. So we are on a battlefield, and most of the people in the pews on Sunday mornings don't think the enemy even exists.
Yeah. And you painted a pretty high drama picture in the Second Coming of Saturn. You talked about how it's not clear whose counsel that even is in that Psalm 82. It could be that Yahweh is barging in on a council that is anti-God or anti-Yahweh, and letting them know what's what. And then Jesus quotes that in the New Testament later.
Right.
So it sounds like what you're saying and reminding our audience of, and this should come as no big surprise to our audience. We've talked about Heiser and we've talked about the Book of Enoch. But I think what you're trying to get across, among other things, is these evil entities, and we'll just pick Shemyaza because that's the topic of the book, Shemyaza being the leader of the Watchers that descended on Mount Hermon, not to be confused specifically necessarily with the quote unquote evil one. That those may be different. Mm-hmm. You're saying Shemyaza is a real specific entity that really specifically existed with the body and exists today, and who we may be seeing again in the future.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that, because I think it's so easy for, especially the Greek mindset and some of the Gnosticism, we think, well, there's the real world and then there's the spiritual world, and they kind of have this meeting place in the middle, and that's what we do on Sunday morning, and the rest of the time they're separate, and we're constantly battling against that, because that is not how the ancient Near Eastern viewed these concepts.
Absolutely. And that would include the Hebrew prophets and the apostles and the early church fathers. They understood that the gods of their pagan neighbors were real, but fallen angels. We've lost that somehow over the last 16 or 1700 years. The entity called Shemyaza, as you mentioned, is, and that's what led to the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, trying to trace the career, if you will, of that character, because he's mentioned in the book of First Enoch. His name is not mentioned in the Bible, Shemyaza, but it seemed that his transgression was so severe that we should be able to pick up the threads of what happened to him after he is punished by being dropped into the bottomless pit or dropped into the abyss in the book of First Enoch.
And just reminding our listeners that Azazel is also in the book of First Enoch and is also in the Bible. So these are not completely divorced conversations.
Yeah,
exactly. That is correct. It's almost like there are two leaders of the rebellion, Shemaiah, who led the commingling of this angelic bloodline with humanity to create these hybrid entities called the Nephilim or the giants, later called Rephaim. Azazel was blamed for teaching humanity things that we weren't supposed to know. So he's sort of a Prometheus character, actually. If you look at Greek mythology, he was punished by Zeus for stealing fire from Mount Olympus and giving it to humanity because we were poor, cold, and in the dark, which is kind of like what the green activists want for us. Yes, we want green energy, but we don't want to mine anything or build anything. So we want you poor, cold, and in the dark. Prometheus, like Azazel, brought humanity things we weren't supposed to know, forbidden knowledge.
Are you considering a book on Azazel as well? And the reason why I ask, and I'm part of asking tongue-in-cheek, because you write books like we crank out podcast episodes.
I wish.
I think he's faster than we are, actually.
Yes. The reason I ask is that's the explosion of technology, even just in my lifetime, is unbelievable and seems to be setting something up. You mentioned earlier the labor pains for the end times. It seems like there's some level of technological advancement that is necessary to even get to the conditions of Revelation and the Antichrist, and we seem to be getting pretty ripe on those fronts. And meanwhile, we're having this we've done entire episodes on the rise of AI and some of these other things. We haven't gone in depth on CERN, but that's another episode we should do. There's this, it's coming from somewhere. And it seems when you get into some of these my background is in tech and tech investing and helping run private equity funds. So I've spent a lot of time with tech developers, and a lot of these guys will openly give credit to what biblically would be called sorcery. They're doing LSD and mushrooms and coming up with new microchip designs. And that's not wives' tales. That's real stuff that's going on.
Yeah, well, like the benzene ring was discovered by a guy who had a dream of a snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. So, this is very old. And the idea of tourism, shamanistic tourism is a big thing. People going to South America to do ayahuasca and take DMT. I think it's very interesting, by the way, that not to rabbit trail too far, but that people in DMT trials that were conducted by Dr. Rick Strassman years ago reported seeing, and other stories from people who just doing it recreationally, report seeing insectoid entities when they're in this spirit realm, and some reptilian as well. And in Peru, a friend, Timothy Albarino, is now in Peru right now investigating those claims of insectoid some things that have been terrorizing villagers deep in the Amazon jungle.
You mean it's not just illegal miners with jetpacks? Dan keeps saying, "Where do I get? I want a jetpack. Those guys have jetpacks. How do I get?"
It seems like the least plausible explanation. Actually, the insectoid entities from another dimension actually makes more sense. But
exactly.
I derailed your thought process earlier. You were talking about Shemaiah and tracing his career, and then I want to be quiet and give Dan and Brian a chance to ask some of their specific questions. But do continue your thought on Shemaiah, his career, and where we can expect to see him again.
So here you've got an entity who led this group of angelic beings to intercede or interfere with humanity, and for that sin, according to 2 Peter 2 verse 4, Peter discussing the punishment of the angels who sinned. God thrust them down to hell, is what it says in our Bible, but the Greek word is Tartarosis. That is another place separate and distinct from Hades. In the Greek world, it was believed that Tartarus was a special level of the netherworld reserved for supernatural threats to the divine order, like the Titans of Greek myth, who were overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians and then cast down to Tartarus, where they were confined for all eternity, Kronos being the king of the Titans. It's like, okay, well, this story of the Watchers in the book of Enoch seems to parallel the story of the Titans of Greek mythology, but when you trace that further back, you find there's a Hurrian story, a creation story, where their god, who occupied the same slot in the pantheon as Kronos, Saturn to the Romans, Baal-Hamon of the Phoenicians, El of the Canaanites, Dagon of the Amorites and the Philistines, Enlil of the Akkadians and Babylonians. The Hurrians called him Kumarbi, and it was the same story. He overthrew his father, castrating him in the process, just like Kronos did with Uranus, and then in turn was overthrown by his son, the storm god, Zeus, overthrowing Kronos. So it's Teshub overthrowing Kumarbi in the older story. Same story. You essentially get the same story roughly with Marduk taking over from Enlil in the Mesopotamian pantheon.
The Zeus version's even a little less violent or gritty than the Kumarbi one.
Yes, that's true, yes. I was trying to be delicate, but
that's fine.
Kumarbi didn't use a sickle. He used his teeth.
Delicate's the word there. Yeah. So just to clarify there, Derek, the one thing that I think was really helpful about your book, and I know we're really just scratching the surface, and it would take a whole series of episodes to get to the level of the linguistic analysis and the historical analysis you put into this, and it's a fascinating read. I have underlines and dog-eared pages all over it. But one of the things that I think is helpful for people to understand is not all the evil entities are the same thing. They're not all created equal, meaning when we talk about Shemyaza is a fallen angel, and an angel is a whole thing in and of itself, where there's a watcher class of the angels, as best as we can understand. So Shemyaza is a watcher class angel that rebelled and led a rebellion along with some of his peers, in that process creating a set of offspring that we broadly refer to as the Nephilim, whose disembodied spirits became the demons. We've tried to explain all this. And as we look at the myths and legends of the past and find these consistencies between them, what we're seeing is that story is playing out over and over. And sometimes when you look at the mythological sets, what they're calling the creator god, or is really the god who is responsible for creating them, which would in this case would be the fallen angel, and in this case Shemyaza. And the reason why I'm pulling that out is because it can be confusing for somebody who has the Western Christian mindset, reading it, saying, okay, there might be some truth to this, reading this and saying, okay, creator, well, that must be Yahweh. Well, not necessarily. Yahweh is usually cast as this very distant, uninvolved figure somewhere way out there, who may or may not ever actually make the casting system of these demonic storylines that have manipulated humanity for so long. So I wanted to clarify that you're saying these quote unquote supreme pagan gods really are probably the higher ranking original fallen watcher class angels. Exactly. And then the lower gods are their offspring, who are the titans or the hybrids, and you're welcome to add any color there.
And I don't know that we can actually take those stories of, say, Kronos and Rhea being the parents of Zeus and the Olympians. I think that is just a story that was told to the pagans to explain the hierarchy.
Also,
I think that all of these, and they lie, these entities were all created by God. But I think when you go back in the ancient world, it would be understandable for so-and-so, for this entity to call this other entity my father, just as, say, the king of a smaller kingdom would refer to, like, the king of Egypt as my father, where a king of another smaller kingdom of roughly equal power is my brother. So I think that's kind of the relationship that is going on there. God created all of these entities. Okay, Kronos and Rhea did not actually procreate and give birth to, the Zeus and the Olympians. They were all created entities, but they had to come up with some kind of a story to explain, why are the old gods no longer here? Why do we now have to do this ritual? We have to dig a pit and summon them from the netherworld to try to talk to them. Well, it's because there was a rebellion, and the storm god who's now in charge, who, by the way, the storm god Zeus, Jupiter, Baal, was identified by Jesus in the Bible as Satan. So I think, and it's clear that from Jesus' comments where he said, if Satan casts out demons by his own power, how will Satan's kingdom stand? Satan in the Old Testament is not connected to the netherworld. He's not considered a king or anything. He's just sort of like the prosecuting attorney going around saying, hey, look at Job, he did this bad thing. But by the New Testament period, something had shifted. And I think it was this change in the spirit realm where you had these older entities who had been thrown into the abyss, where they are now confined, and now this new group of entities probably Watcher class entities, possibly the ones that were delegated responsibility by God after the Tower of Babel incident. We see in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, where Moses says, when God gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided the nations, he numbered them according to the number of the sons of God. When you go back to Genesis chapter 10, you read the table of nations there, you see there are 70 names in that list there, which is significant because in the ancient Near East, not just Israel, but the ancient Near East as a whole, that number 70 represented the complete set. All of them, not one left out. So essentially what happened is after Babel, God divided the nations and said, okay, look, in the same way he later gave in to the demands by the Israelites of the prophet Samuel. We want a king. All right, I'll give you a king, but you're not going to like it. Same thing happened after Babel. Okay, you built this artificial mountain to create a point of contact between you and the spirit realm, a portal, if you will. All right, I will let these lesser Elohim administer this creation. They will be the gods of the nations. You see that in Deuteronomy 4, verses 19 and 20. But as with King Saul and the Israelites, humanity was not being rewarded by these lesser Elohim given authority over humanity. And in the writings of the early church fathers, it's clear that the early Christian church understood that that's what was going on. They were given the job to come here and administer humanity, and they took advantage of their position, set themselves up as gods, demanded sacrifice even of our own children. And that's why you see in Psalm 82, God saying, though you are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. So in that being the case, you get this group of supernatural beings, Elohim, small e Elohim, confined to Tartarus, according to Peter, for their sin back in Genesis chapter 6. It just struck me as odd that you don't see anything more about him in the Bible. I mean, this is an entity who is called the chief of the watchers in the book of 1 Enoch. They're punished. They're in chains and gloomy darkness. They're there. They were so dangerous that God had to lock them up. While Satan, who we've been taught is the evil one, the most dangerous supernatural enemy of God and of Israel and of Jesus Christ and his church, and yet he's free to walk the earth. How bad must this other guy have been, Shemiyaza, if he's thrown in the abyss until the final judgment? He gets out one. So in any way, piecing all this together, I have present the case in the Second Coming of Saturn that Shemiyaza, the leader of that Genesis 6 rebellion, is now confined in the netherworld, but through demonic minions perhaps, like a mafia boss controlling action on the street while he's in prison. He is still influencing the world, and I argue that this is the entity known to the ancient world as El of the Canaanites, Dagon of the Philistines and Amorites, Enlil or Elil of the Akkadians and Babylonians, Milcom of the Ammonites, which means Molech of the Hebrews, and Kronos, Saturn, Baal, Haman. In all of these entities, there is a definite underworld connection. And in many of these cultures, that entity, especially when you're looking at like Baal Haman of the Phoenicians and the Tophets, where they found literally thousands of infant children and young children slaughtered, burned, and buried in clay jars at these Tophets in Carthage and Sicily and Sardinia, similar to the Tophet in the Valley of Hinnom, just south of Jerusalem. There was sacrifice involved, and in many cases, child sacrifice involved with this particular entity. This is an entity who, I argue in the book, may have been the high priest in Eden, because I believe that when you look at Isaiah 14, Lucifer, as he's erroneously called in the Hebrews, Halel, by Jerome, following Origen, who was the first to translate Halel ben Shakar, which means light bringer, son of dawn. Light bringer in Latin is lux and pharos, so there's where you get Lucifer. I think that's referring to Shemiyaza. I don't think that's Satan. Again, when you look at Satan in the Old Testament, and by the way, it's always accompanied with the definite article the. It's the Satan, like the adversary, the prosecuting attorney. It's a job title. I think Isaiah 14 and the parallel chapter in Ezekiel 28, describing that rebel who was tossed out of Eden, I think that's Shemiyaza. And I think he's the same entity who currently in the abyss emerges as the angel of the bottomless pit in Revelation 9 as the destroyer, Abaddon or Apollyon.
So tying some of this together, so we're talking about this entity who was tossed down, is locked up in chains, wondering how is this entity still having influence on the world. And you go into that in the book a little bit with kind of the death cult and the death worship, and talking about maybe demons carrying messages back and forth, and which I believe is connected to the term of the travelers, right? With the
yes, it's a Canaanite term that was applied to the Rephaim. It's Ovarim, which literally means those who cross over or those on the other side. Which, interestingly enough, was the name of Mount Nebo given by God to Moses. Climb this mountain of Avarim, climb this mountain of the travelers.
Right.
Yeah, so can you go into that real quick? Just
again, this is a thing that blew my mind was discovering that the Canaanites and the Amorites who lived around ancient Israel knew who the Rephaim were. It was not something that Moses invented to demonize, pardon the pun, the Canaanites whose land they were about to take. They knew who the Rephaim were. In Ugaritic, the rough transliteration is Raphaima. Very similar. They found an inscription at an ancient Amorite city called Katna that seems to depict a middle tier of supernatural entities, like the bottom level of reality. You've got humanity, the natural realm. Then on the top of this inscription, you've got the great gods like Baal and Astarte and so on. And then in the middle, you've got these other entities that are believed to be the Rephaim. Well, that's what the Canaanites thought about these entities, the mighty kings who were of old. It's like in Genesis chapter 6, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, or the men of the name, the pre-flood giants. The demigods.
The Anunnaki and the Apkallu as well, right? The same entities that are revered as culture heroes by the different
Mesopotamian cultures
that were around them.
Yeah, and learning that just within the last 20 years, scholars have come to believe, it's like, wait a minute, the Greeks knew who the Rephaim were. The demigod heroes of the Greeks, like Heracles and Perseus, were Rephaim. A scholar named Amar Anus actually showed etymologically that the term used for the demigod heroes of the ancient world in Greek, Morapes anthropoi, actually comes from the same Semitic root as Rapayuma and Rephaim. So the Greeks worshipped the Rephaim. Heracles was one of the Nephilim. Well, demigod, it follows logically, but now we can show it etymologically as well. Amar Anus also showed that the origin of the word or the name Titan comes from the name of an Amorite tribe that was venerated as and connected to the Rephaim at Ugarit, the council of the Titanu in the underworld. So, how about that? The Greeks just got their religion from the Canaanites. Who knew?
Evidently you figured it out.
Well, I didn't figure it out. It's like, again, there are scholars out there who've done this, and we put the pieces together. You see that all of this fits together, and the early church understood it. The writings of the early church fathers for about the first 400 years after the resurrection knew that the origin of giants was from the spirits, or the origin of demons rather, was the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood. And they connect the Titans to all of this. So you've got this connection. The Titans of the Greeks are the watchers of the book of First Enoch, who are the sinful angels of Peter and Jude. It all fits together. As you said, the Apkallu, who were condemned to the Absu by Marduk when he got angry, told never to return. It's the same story. It's just the only true version is the one that comes through in the Bible, and then some of the Jewish literature in the Second Temple period that sort of expands on what we read in Scripture.
I really loved the part in the book where you quoted all of those early church fathers on that very specific topic. It was like this beautiful little compilation of what the thought process and what the worldview was of the first century, second century, third century church. And part of all of this spiritual warfare, there's been a systematic and successful dumbing down of the Western Church. My question, it's removing all supernatural of anything. It's splitting the worldview that was always integrated, that this supernatural, the spiritual, and the physical were all part of the same sphere of life, to break it into half and make one of them seem unreal. And so one of my questions is, whose side was Augustine on anyway?
Well, I think part of his, there's no question Augustine was brilliant. He was just wrong about the Nephilim. He came out of a pagan, really Gnostic cult that tended to venerate angels. And so I think he was overreacting in the other direction.
Right.
What it was, and I can't remember the name, not Manichaeism. Maybe it was Manichaeism. But anyway, I think
right.
I think it was an overreaction to his early upbringing. But he popularized an idea that was put forward in the 4th century by Julius Africanus. Right.
Yeah. The Sethite view.
Yeah, the Sethite view.
Which is taught in many Protestant colleges today.
Right. The irony is that I've just learned within the last couple of years that Bible scholars, who are not the ones who are pastoring churches, but biblical scholars, and not all of them are Christian either. They just look at it as interesting, an archaeological problem to be solved, or textual variants to be researched and discussed. But the consensus view among biblical scholars since about 1900 is that the Genesis 6 account means what it plainly says, that these sons of God, these angelic beings, went into women, which of course is a euphemism, and produced giants.
Right.
But that is not what's being taught in seminary. So that is not what we hear in the pews, if our pastors deal with it at all. And sadly, that drains a lot of the conflict between the evil intelligences in the spirit realm out of the Bible. It takes all of that out of there. And again, if we don't think the enemy is real, then how seriously are we going to take the need for salvation when the enemy is just, it's just the evil that's inside human hearts? Like the shadows, who knows what lurks in the hearts of men. No, I'm sorry. There are evil intelligences out there who want to destroy us and everything that we love.
The other thing that you have been doing in your ministry, apart from writing books and these kind of things, that I just found absolutely fascinating was all of the work you've done related to the baptism place of Jesus, where the ministry was, the northern Essenes, and that second book of the Watchers, the term Son of Man, and the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Like, all those things, they just make the entire journey that Jesus took, that was recorded for us in the New Testament, and just expands it into a whole new spiritual realm, even beyond, unseen realm and all of the things that Dr. Heiser did, which is phenomenal. But this, when you say, that Psalm 23, that wasn't just a euphemism or a helpful analogy. There's an actual real place. And look, there's all these dolmens. There's 5,200 dolmens floating around over here. So if you could talk a little bit about some of that, because that's just brilliant, tying together archaeology and megalithic sites and it just astonishes me that the Lord is allowing us to see this, because I've got to think that over the last 2,000 years there have been a lot more dedicated scholars more dedicated, more intelligent than me. I think it's on purpose. I think God's giving us this information now on purpose.
Well, I agree with you, and this all stems from this conflict in Genesis chapter 6, because without the creation of these hybrid spirits, these hybrid beings whose spirits were then condemned to wander the earth as demons, and again, getting back to the Greeks, it blows my mind that Hesiod, who wrote a lot of what we know about Greek mythology in his books like Theogony and Works and Days, agreed that the origin of the what they called daemons were the spirits of these men of the golden age, the moropes anthropoi, who lived when Kronos ruled in heaven, the pre-flood world. And again, these are the men that Amar Anu said, moropes, that comes from Rephaim. Yes, the difference was that the Greeks thought that these spirits would wander the earth helping humanity, because they were kindly. So the Israelites knew what their neighbors believed. You've got all of these megalithic funerary monuments all over Israel and the Jordan Valley that relate to this cult of the dead. We spent a day with the archaeologist who's done the most recent excavation at Gilgal Rephaim back in March, Dr. Mike Freakman, who, God bless him, by the way, he's been called up in his reserve unit. Just sent him a note the other day, and he sent back a picture. So you got here this 35-year-old archaeologist who's now, carrying around an automatic weapon and on guard duty for one of the villages on the Golan. This is a cult that goes back to the pre-biblical era, really to the prehistoric era, this idea of venerating these spirits who come from the underworld. And again, the monuments to this cult are all over Israel. These dolmens that you mentioned, those are giant stone monuments that look like tables. In fact, that's what the word means. It's from a Celtic language, Brittonic, that means table. The simplest form, two big slabs of rock with a tabletop slab across the top. And there are, in that valley, the Jordan River flows through between Mount Hermon and the Sea of Galilee. There are 1,100 lining the hills on either side of this valley, which until the 1950s was a marsh. That marsh is mentioned in the Baal cycle, the Ugaritic texts. This is the Amorite kingdom in northern Syria that was contemporary with the Judges, period of the Judges, destroyed around 1200 BC. And in that area of the Hula Marsh, the Hula Valley, Baal was supposed to have confronted the god of death, Mot. Then we read in another epic poem from that kingdom, the epic of Akat, a young man named Akat who's killed by the war goddess Anat because he won't give her his magic bow. Here's a pro tip. Never insult the deity who's wearing a girdle made of human skulls. Not a good move.
Yeah.
So anyway, she has him killed, and the father goes searching for him. Yeah. Of course, they didn't have the power of the Holy Spirit, so the father goes looking for his son and says, when I find him, I will weep for him and I will mourn, and I will weep for him and I will mourn. And finally he says the third time, when he finds him, I will bury him in a tomb at Kinneret. Well, that's the Sea of Galilee. Now bear in mind, you're talking about a kingdom that 3,200 years ago was located on the Mediterranean coast near the modern border with Turkey. So this was a long ways away and across a mountain range. And yet they knew there was something about the Sea of Galilee that was connected to this cult of the dead. I will bury him in a tomb for the underworld gods, a term that in Ugaritic the equivalent would be the Elohim Eretz. That's a reference to the Rephaim. In other words, the demonic spirits of the Nephilim, or like we read in Ezekiel 32, the mighty chiefs, or the chiefs of the Gibborim in the midst of Sheol. That's what the pagans around ancient Israel knew and what they thought about that region between Mount Hermon and the Sea of Galilee, and of course the kingdom of Bashan, where Og of Bashan was the ruler in the days of Moses, just about the same time as this epic poem I'm describing. That was believed by the Canaanites and the Israelites to be the literal entrance to the netherworld. It was like the entrance to the Canaanite hell. So that's the region that we're talking about between the Sea of Galilee and Mount Hermon, and this valley that the Jordan River runs through between the Mount Hermon and the Sea of Galilee. I think that's what is being described in this area as the valley of the shadow of death. Jesus was most likely baptized there. We read in John chapter 1, beginning in verse 28, where John is confronted by scribes and priests sent by the Pharisees in Jerusalem to investigate what John is teaching and on what authority. And verse 28 reads, "These things happen in Bethany across the Jordan, where John was baptizing." And then verse 29, "The next day John sees Jesus. Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world," and he baptizes him. Now, we've been taught that John was baptizing down near Jericho. In fact, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the officially sanctioned site by the UN, is down there near Jericho, so I guess we can trust that they've got it right, huh?
What is it, 90 miles away or something?
It's about 90 miles away as I figured it. Back in the day when you had to walk that distance across those hills and mountains, that was a better part of a week, I would think, especially if you're taking a day off for the Sabbath.
And you mentioned that Andrew ran home to get his brother.
Well, yeah, John says
he
that
didn't run
once
90 miles.
No, Andrew was the first of John's disciples to follow Jesus. He runs home to get Peter, says, we found the Messiah. And then the next disciple is Philip, who is from their village of Bethsaida, which is 1.5 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. So this is all happening north of the Sea of Galilee. In 1877, a scholar by the name of Claude Condor wrote that, look, even though the King James Bible translated Bethany across the Jordan, meaning east of the Jordan River, as Beth Abara, again, our old friend Origen was the one who stepped in and changed it, because in Greek, it's Bethania, but Origen said there is no Bethany east of the Jordan River, so it must be wrong. Even though the best and oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of John say Bethania, it must be wrong because I can't find it. So that's how the King James Version came to read Beth Abara. But Bethany, according to Condor, probably a transliteration, the Greek Bethania, a transliteration of the Latin name Botania, which was the Latin name for Bashan, the region of Bashan, Og of Bashan, entrance to the netherworld, literally the gates of hell. Jesus was Jesus baptized there.
And Jesus said, upon this rock,
and of course,
he was standing right in front of the gate of the temple of Jupiter, but before that it was a temple to Baal, I believe.
Well, yes, and of course you've got the cave there called the Grotto of Pan. This is why the place today is called Banyas, or that's the Greek pronunciation, or the Arabic pronunciation of Paneas, the Greek name for it.
Derek, wasn't there a new serpentine mound just discovered in the northern, just north of Bashan?
Well, yeah, back in 2013, Doug Van Dorn, in his book Giants, Sons of the Gods, was looking at Google Earth to try to get a handle on that area there, and he spotted it. I had read the book around 2016, but I somehow skipped over that part. And so when Sharon and I came back from visiting Gilgal Rephaim in our 2019 tour, I wanted to, get an overhead shot with Google Earth to find the, what's on the horizon when you're looking out from the central core. What is there? Why did they put the gates where they did, entering into Gilgal Rephaim? And then I spotted what Doug had spotted, which is this 3/4 mile long, 200-foot wide serpentine shape covered with dolmens.
Yeah,
1/4 mile from Gilgal Rephaim. I can't be the first one who's discovered this.
Well, but there hasn't been a lot of academic publishing on it. It's like an unacknowledged megalith.
Right. The only guy who's written about it within the last 40 years, I think, is the guy we spent the day with there, Dr. Mike Freakman.
Okay.
He took us
that's
on the back of the Serpent Mound, and we were looking at this thing, and they're like, okay, what is this all about? And again, he believes it's connected to this cult of the dead, veneration of the ancestors, this idea that we have to sustain them in the afterlife because they're hungry. We have to feed them.
So let's talk about that idea, and the reason why is because I have a sneaking suspicion this is coming back. And part of the reason why I have a sneaking suspicion it's coming back is because if you look, for example, at the just the most recent Disney Pixar movies, there are a handful that have to do with the dead, and including Coco came out recently. That's all about the Day of the Dead. There's Soul, which is about going to the realm after death to find music. And Canto isn't specifically about the dead. And then there's so in other words,
it is about ancestors.
It's about ancestors. Yeah. It's about hereditary magic. And part of what we've done with this podcast is we've looked at some of the pop culture stuff, and it's unbelievable how some of these things that you're talking about, this worship of dead ancestors and the necessity of worshiping of dead ancestors, or the gifting of abilities coming from dead beings or dead entities, is something that's in children's movies today consistently.
Yeah.
And not just consistently, but almost awkwardly crammed in. I don't recall this necessarily being what the movies were about when I was a kid. And it seems like it's all coming back. And what I'm trying to turn the conversation to a little bit is, what should we be looking at in the world around us? Where do you see the deceptions likely to be? What are we going to be told is good that's really not good in coming days? And where do you think Christians are likely to be deceived or going to be tempted to be deceived? How are these beings who and just reminding everybody, including myself, that You look at Shemyaza, for example. Obviously dangerous enough that God locked him up in the underworld. Okay. Well, when humans saw him, they said, oh, we should totally worship and follow this guy. So it's not like he's this hideous, obvious destructive power. He's probably very enchanting because people willfully want to worship him. And if we look at 1st, 2nd Samuel or the Kingdom of Israel as a parallel, that may demand the right to name a king and say, no, we really want to have something as a king. Enough with you, Yahweh. We want something like the other nations have. So if that's a parallel, then what is it about these beings and if they're coming back, what's it going to look like in today's world in such a way that people say, oh, we got to follow this. This is the future of humanity.
Well, I want to add one thing to that question, just to put it in the back of your head.
That was Joel rambling followed by a question mark. So if you want to call it a question. Yeah,
so with the Cult of the Dead and the tie-ins of the 3 days and the feet, there's so many things that you have exposed in my brain anyway. Do they believe, or were they supposedly bringing back those spirits of the Rephaim into bodies, into humans, or only into idols? Was it both?
Well, that's what demonic possession is.
I know what possession is, but right. They do that without the ritual.
True.
Just like you said, these guys like, Parsons and others is like they're useful idiots because, as Michael Heiser said, if these guys really need someone to make a ritual circle and let them in the door, then they're pretty
lame. Yeah. I think a lot of it is just deception to see, to get humans committed to this, these entities and these false gods, these false religions. I tend to think that you could read the phone book if your intention is to open yourself up to spirits. It's not the words that you're speaking; it's the intent in your heart.
So it's the
opens
will
you up to
and the
these
focus
entities.
of the consciousness, almost like prayer.
Right. Exactly. If you want to give permission, it's like this story, the old trope with the vampire story. You have to give the vampire permission to cross the threshold to come into your home.
Right.
But once he's in there, you can't revoke it. Well, if you are demonically possessed or oppressed, you can get relief from that. You can be delivered from that.
But they're going to put up a fight.
I think these spirits, first of all, there is a long marketing campaign that's been done by these entities. We are supposed to believe somehow that we Christians are responsible for all the ills of the world. We think we're going to get out of here before things get bad so we can just loot the world's resources and pollute and just leave the environment. Okay, that's not the Bible that I read. We're supposed to be good caretakers of what we've been given because this wonderful planet is a gift created especially for us. We Christians are supposed to be, evil, patriarchal, women oppressing. It's like, I'm sorry, but that's not the Bible, not the Bible that I read. We men are commanded to love our wives. Our wives are not commanded to love us. We are commanded to love them sacrificially. Yea, even unto turning off the football on Saturday. But this is how the world has been brainwashed, twisting, basically setting up a straw man of Christian theology and then knocking that down. And then we see it in Hollywood. Sharon and I actually did a couple of episodes recently of our weekly Unraveling Revelation program about the Godzilla MonsterVerse movies. Because especially in the most recent one, Godzilla King of Monsters, which was the 2019 release, man, did they tap into some ancient Mesopotamian religion and other like Japanese, Chinese, religion.
I haven't watched that one.
Oh boy, I'll tell you what, Godzilla and his buddies have been rebranded as the Titans, the original and rightful rulers of Earth. Their return is a good thing. Look, they're restoring the balance that we human. Now, the Godzilla movies, when you go back to the Tojo films from the 1960s, especially, starting in the 1960s, Godzilla was sort of a force of nature rebuking humanity, punishing humanity for our environmental sins. So that is a strain that would, resonate well, especially in Japan, because, they got hit with nuclear bombs back in the 1940s. The original Godzilla from 1954 was actually pretty scary because it was basically about that. They got pretty silly as you got into the 60s and 70s, where you had like a sludge monster that would fight, Godzilla had to save us from this monster of, sludge and pollution.
But isn't it interesting that messaging is so similar to the Gnostic messaging you hear from alien abductee experiencers, for example, where they're coming back with these very Gnostic ideas.
Yeah,
of
they're going to save us from ourselves.
Yeah, and how we're not really doing a very good job, and how we're kind of ruining everything. But we can ascend if we'll just listen to what these guys have to say and do it the way they're telling us to, because they want, as Alberino would say, they want that dominion over the earth that was originally given to humanity.
Right, but these entities now, these titans who've been sleeping for a long time, are suddenly brought back because a group of environmental terrorists, eco-terrorists, want to wake them up and set them loose to teach humanity a lesson. And they wake up the arch enemy of Godzilla, Monster Zero, or King Ghidorah, who is in the Antarctic, which is sort of a H.P. Lovecraft trope there.
Something's going on in the Antarctic, by the way. I mean, it's just, there just is. I don't know what, but something's going on.
I just re-listened to Graham Hancock's Fingerprint of the Gods, and I'm reminded that the Antarctic is Atlantis.
Yeah, or Mountains of Madness. That's the H.P. Lovecraft one down there, yeah.
That's right.
So anyway, Ghidorah is awakened, and suddenly you've got these two titans that are going at it, because as the story develops, you learn that Ghidorah was not supposed to be here. He fell to Earth. Like, oh, okay.
Sounding familiar.
I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. And Godzilla has to come from his underground lair. He loses round one to Ghidorah. He basically retreats to his underground lair, the abyss, basically, bottom of the ocean, almost a Cthulhu sort of thing. But he is recharged because, he lives off radiation. So this submarine with nuclear weapons goes down there to give him a jolt. To
give him the old what for?
Yeah, to restart his heart, basically. And so he's resurrected. But when you go into his underground lair, no kidding, this submarine goes through a portal that is guarded on two sides by Lamassu. These are the bearded, human-headed, winged bull creatures that were outside the palace of Nineveh.
Yeah.
The Assyrian palace.
They just unearthed two more, like really nicely preserved ones.
Dan, we saw those in the museum, and when we were there in the British Museum. Remember seeing those?
Yeah. We've seen those. Yeah, that's probably what the cherubim looked like. The cherubim. Did you notice that the ones in the British Museum did not have hooves? They had lion's paws.
Yes. Even my
jet
lag
lion, bull, eagle. Yeah. That's not by coincidence.
Wow.
So Godzilla is in this underground palace that you got to climb the steps. It's like climbing the steps of a ziggurat, a step pyramid in ancient Mesopotamia, where Godzilla is on top of the pyramid, where he then is revived, resurrected, brought back from the dead to fight up. I think what they're depicting there is, okay, you've got Kronos or Shemiyaza as Godzilla coming back to fight off Satan, King Ghidorah, who's, now maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the message is very clear in this movie that the Titans are good for Earth and they need to come back to restore balance because the Earth is out of balance. We've also seen the Titans reappearing in, there was a movie starring Sam Worthington, who interestingly enough was the guy who was in the Clash of the Titans and Wrath of the Titans. He starred in a movie that went straight to Netflix. It was pretty bad, but it's called The Titan, where he is upgraded, transhuman, so that he could be sent to the moon of Saturn. Is Titan the moon of Saturn or moon of Jupiter? Anyway, he went to the moon because it's a watery world, so he was genetically enhanced so that he could live in this ultra-cold aquatic environment.
That movie. It was set in Australia or something, or?
Well, I don't recall that it was set in Australia, but anyway, the movie was called The Titan. And
I don't remember the name of the movie, but it was similar. It was transhuman, take a human and turn them into something that can survive on Neptune, for example.
Mm-hmm.
because people need to leave the planet, and
Right.
because we've destroyed it.
So here's a thought exercise. So Titan, moon of Saturn, and I know we need to wrap here soon to honor your time commitment to us, Derek. We just go forever, but we're I know it's later where you are. Okay, so are these guys who are writing these stories, like the Godzilla story that you described, are they just extremely good researchers, or are they getting inspired somewhere to get this level of consistency? And I'm not trying to put to go on a witch hunt against any particular author, but it just seems when you start zooming out and looking at these, like, why is everybody writing the same story over and over?
Yeah.
And where's
I
that
think it's probably
from?
a little of both. Probably a little of both. I mean, if we understand that we're in a wrestling match against inhuman opponents, you have to consider the possibility that these principalities, powers, demons are whispering to and maybe inspiring some of these authors. I mean, the Titans that are brought back in Godzilla, King of Monsters actually have names like Abaddon, Apollyon, Behemoth, Methuselah. Some of them are from other pantheons as well, but many of these are biblical names. And again, it's not coincidental. The artwork inside the palace of Godzilla, when you're going into this underworld thing, is clearly inspired by the art and iconography of ancient Mesopotamia. So, it's great storytelling. And, I always love me a giant monster movie. So, we've watched Godzilla, King of Monsters probably 10 times. But there is a message that is being put out there, and it is this, that the Titans, Godzilla and the Titans are coming back, and that's a good thing. Well, we see when that happens in the book of Revelation. Revelation 9:11, when the abyss is open, and the angel of the abyss, who is king over those in the bottomless pit, Kronos, Shemiyaza, Abaddon, Apollyon, Molech, Saturn, he will lead this group, and it will literally be hell on earth, but only for 5 months. And this is the other thing that I think convinces me that we're looking at the same group here as the group in Genesis chapter 6. The number of days that Noah's ark was on the water, we're told in Genesis chapter 7 and 8, 150 days. That's an odd number. It's not common in biblical symbology. It's not 3 or 7 or 10 or 40 or 70. 150 days. In a lunar calendar, that is exactly 5 months. 5 months that Noah's Ark was on the water while these entities were chained up in the abyss, and their children, the giants, the hybrid giants, were dying with all of humanity except for the 8 on the ark. And at the end, they get out. They get exactly 5 months to punish those without the seal of God in their foreheads. It is interesting seeing the messaging that is being put forward. The church is, for the most part, more than half the church is asleep at the switch, because more than half of the church doesn't believe that the Holy Spirit is a real entity, or that actually exists, or that Satan is a real entity. We've got a bunch of people who call themselves followers of Jesus Christ, but they don't really understand the nature of his mission and what he came to save us from, and who he came to save us from.
Well, we're doing our darndest to try and help wake the church up. So, Dan, I know you've got you've been very patient with the question, and Derek, we'll let you go here shortly with a couple closing thoughts.
Well, yeah, Derek, you just directly answered the question I was about to bring up about what happens when those things do come back out of the abyss, and the 5 month thing. So just one closing thought. Last week I was just reading through John and came to John chapter 10. So just wanted to read real quick John 10 and 11. So this is Jesus speaking. It says, "The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." And so, just in tying it all back to Christ, we were talking about these entities that are bent on destruction. We talked about the stuff going on in Israel, where there's just this hate and evil focused on destruction. We talk about these entities that are chained up. We talk about entities that aren't yet chained up, that just are all focused on death and destruction and tearing people down. And then we have the example of Jesus, who flips it all on its head, right, and lays down his own life. You mentioned in your book, Derek, that Jesus is the ultimate reversal of the cult of child sacrifice, right, where he's willing to lay down himself. And so, just listeners, and I've got to always keep reminding myself of this as we kind of expand our paradigm and look at the world as such a bigger place than we were taught in church growing up, or than we can even begin to understand. That it's so important to always keep bringing it back to the gospel. And you do this in your book, Derek. You close it with the gospel, and I really appreciate that. So, right, like, yes, all this stuff is true. There are real enemies, more than one, that are bent on destruction,
and they're coming back. But we also know who wins.
They never left, but
right.
They're not the only ones coming back.
Right. But we know who wins. And we're invited to join his team. And
Amen.
And there's nothing better we can do than to do that, and to share that good news with others. So, yeah.
Dan, I think that's a great note, and that you're always so good about bringing us back to our hope in Christ at the end. I know we could go on and on. Maybe we can get you back on here sometime, Derek. We've got so much more where that came from, and I know our audience has really enjoyed your input. It's been a wonderful conversation and an honor for us to have you join our little podcast here. Take a minute, let our audience, who is going to be little. There are dozens of us, Brian.
I know there are dozens of us. Yes, we have over 1,000 downloads. We're so big.
Yeah, we're an order of magnitude bigger than that, but it's a big world out there. So I want to give you a chance, Derek, just to let our audience know where they can find more like this, because there's a lot of people who are hungry, and they're asking us, well, when are you going to do your next episode? And we do them as fast as we can, and we synthesize things and pull them together, and we do the best job we can. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. I recently recommended the Gilbert House Fellowship to somebody who said, where can I get a really good through the Bible study? Like, these guys will take you all the way through. And so tell them where they can find the stuff that you and Sharon are working on, you and the team, what URLs, and we'll include some of this. If you can send me your favorite links, we'll put it in the show notes. Tell them where to find you and what you're up to, and then we'll try to make sure we get some people pointed your way here.
Appreciate that. And I think the easiest thing to do is just go to gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org, and we kind of use that as our hub for everything that we do. We've got a link there to PID Radio, which is our weekly geo and theo-political podcast, my weekly interview program, A View from the Bunker, our weekly broadcast show, Unraveling Revelation, and of course, the Gilbert House Fellowship Bible Study. All of that is right there. Probably even easier than that. Once you're there, go to the link that says app, gilberthouse.org/app, and add our app to your phone or tablet, which gets you all of our content, but has, in addition, an audio Bible with multiple translations, written but also audio. It's got a blog section. We're releasing articles excerpted from our books every Wednesday, and there's also a messaging feature, which is sort of like it's like a small version of a social media gathering place with different rooms where you can go in there, comment on the programs, ask us questions, ask for prayer, and pray for one another. That's actually become one of the most active apps on my phone, other than the one that broadcasts all of the missile alerts in Israel the last couple of weeks, sadly. But gilberthouse.org/app, iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle, Fire phones and tablets. And that also guarantees that if I say something on my podcast that gets us canceled again, we will continue to get all of our content out there. So our app is hosted by a Christian company, developed by a Christian company. They host all the content, and they're not interested in censoring us. So we're very happy to have that team there. And they've also developed apps for like Skywatch TV, Prophecy Watchers, L.A. Marzulli, many other people use that same company. So all of that, though, linked at gilberthouse.org.
And I'll make a plug for it because I downloaded the app and then I immediately turned around and bought the October special.
Oh, sweet.
Which is 7 hours of Michael Heiser interviews from their ministry, as well as Veneration, the book, which I already bought.
That's not Veneration of Michael Heiser. This is
no, that's Veneration. It's the cult of venerating Satan, But I'd already bought Veneration, but I went ahead and bought it again in hard copy. So now I have 2 copies.
There you go.
And I think the key item in that package is the book by Vicki Joy Anderson called They Only Come Out at Night. And if you're looking for a book to discuss and recommend to your listeners, I would highly recommend that. Vicki is an excellent researcher and writer. The book is about sleep paralysis and night terrors and the spiritual causes. And she's dealt with it herself for years. And so she offers some practical spiritual warfare tools to help deal with that. So if you've got a child who's dealing with night terrors and sleep paralysis, if it's something that plagues you, that book by Vicki Joy Anderson, They Only Come Out at Night, published by L.A. Marzulli, highly recommended. I
had a very interesting gospel conversation with somebody just recently who is a very secular person. And they said, well, I don't really believe any of that stuff. I don't think that there's a spiritual realm. And I said, well, you ever wake up at night and have something in your room that shouldn't be there? And they said, well, yeah, there was this one time. And then when I said, well, it's not just you, it's lots of people. And then they go, wait a second, you mean lots of people are experiencing this? And I said, yeah, there's a lot of it. And then they went, well, maybe I've been thinking about this all wrong. I said, yeah. And there are answers for this stuff. And it got this person who was well-meaning, but just kind of misinformed by the world, very interested in scripture when they realized that there are answers for this stuff and there's actual power for these things that this person had been rendered powerless. So we should, that would be a very interesting topic. If we could get Vicki Joy Anderson, if you have a line to her, we would love to have her on to talk about the book and have the conversation. Yeah, happy to do it. She's, in fact, she lives here locally. So she and her father moved here from Minnesota a few years ago. Right. And we are now blessed to be able to, go out to lunch with them on a regular basis because, Vicki is a delight, wonderful sense of humor. But again, more importantly, excellent writer, wonderful researcher, and filled with the Holy Spirit. And that topic is so potent for getting conversations with people who wouldn't necessarily set foot in a church. They're not going to, they don't want to talk to you about the Bible, but they will talk to you about what their sleep paralysis demon. They'll have, and I say that because that's the phrase that's used in the internet parlance to the point where it's a meme and a joke because so many people experience this. It's a very good way to get somebody willing to have a conversation that they otherwise wouldn't. So thanks for bringing that up. Well, Derek Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a wonderful conversation. The time has absolutely flown by. I know our audience has loved this. We really appreciate the hard work, the insight. We appreciate the years and years and years of foundational stuff that you've put together and what you call this alternative Christianity space. And we don't, we've frequently told people who say, well, why are you guys coming up with all this new stuff? We're telling them, this isn't new stuff. This is the original stuff. This is the stuff that was exactly normal that we need to get back to. So it's not the alternative. Everybody else is living in the alternative. This is Christianity when the early church was early and before it got politically moved around, and this was the norm. And we're trying to get back there because I think it's going to be really important. So
before the first version of Dominionism took over with Constantine.
There you go. Right. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Derek. We'll let you know when this comes out and make sure you get a link to it. We'll include your links in our show notes. So sounds great. Mystery Babylon audience, thanks for joining us for this 23rd episode of the Mystery Babylon podcast. And we look forward to the next episode.